There is a crack in the earth in southern Jordan that most people alive today will never walk through. It is called the Sick. It is 1.2 kilometers long. In places, it is barely 3 meters wide. The walls on either side rise to over 180 meters, which means when you are inside it, the sky above you is just a thin ribbon of blue light, and everything else is sandstone, ancient, layered, red, and silent. The ground under your feet was smoothed by the Nabataeans 2,000 years ago. The niches carved into the walls at regular intervals once held oil lamps that burned at night. If you run your fingers along the stone as you walk, you can feel the groove where a water channel was cut directly into the cliff face, a channel that carried fresh spring water into a city that had no business existing in this desert. And then the canyon curves, just slightly, just enough that you can't see what's ahead. The walls press closer. The air smells of mineral dust and something older than anything you have a name for. Your footsteps echo off rock that has been absorbing sound for 2 millennia. And then, through a sliver of space between 2 sandstone walls, you see it. Just a corner at first, a column, the edge of a pediment. Rose-red stone carved with a precision that doesn't seem possible without machines. And then you take 3 more steps, and the walls open, and the whole thing is suddenly there in front of you, 40 meters high, glowing in the morning light like it is generating its own heat from inside. The treasury of Petra. The first thing most people do is stop breathing. That moment, that specific involuntary lungs forgot what they were doing moment, was engineered. Deliberately, precisely, intentionally engineered by a civilization that understood human psychology well enough to design a city around it. The Nabataeans positioned the treasury so that it could only be approached through the Sick, so that it could only be revealed at the last possible second, so that every trader, every diplomat, every foreign ambassador who arrived at their city would be hit with exactly that sensation the moment they emerged from the canyon. Your first impression of Petra was not accidental. It was choreographed. 2,000 years later, it still works perfectly. Here's the thing about Petra, though. The version you know is not the real story. The version you learned, if you learned anything at all, is a story about a beautiful lost city rediscovered by a brave explorer. A ruin frozen in rose-red stone in the middle of a Jordanian desert, famous mostly because Harrison Ford walked past it in a movie. It is a story about a postcard. It is not a story about what was actually there. The real story is stranger, more specific, and infinitely more astonishing than that. The real story is about a civilization so far ahead of its time that the water engineers who built ancient Rome studied their techniques. A civilization that kept the most powerful empires of the ancient world, Greece, Egypt, and Rome, paying tribute and tolls for over 3 centuries. A civilization that left almost no written record of itself, built one of the most sophisticated cities ever constructed in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and then, somehow, faded from Western memory so completely that for 1,000 years, the world forgot it had ever existed. Not because it was destroyed, because it was ignored. What if I told you the Nabataeans were not mysterious nomads who got lucky? What if the treasury is not a treasury at all, and never was? What if the real miracle of Petra is not the carved stone, but what runs beneath it? A water system so precisely engineered that modern computer simulations still struggle to fully model how it worked. What if the city that supposedly vanished is still being discovered right now, with new structures still emerging from the sand in the 24th century in one of the most studied archaeological sites on Earth? Settle in. Get comfortable. We are going back to the desert, but not the desert you think you know. We are going to meet the people who made the impossible ordinary, who built a city where cities could not survive, and who built it so brilliantly that 2,000 years of wind and earthquake and empire have not been able to
fully erase it. The story of Petra starts long before the first stone was carved, and it starts with a question that the ancient world's most powerful rulers could not stop asking. Who controls the road?
Before we walk into the canyon, we need to dismantle a few things, because almost everything most people believe about Petra is, if not entirely wrong, just incomplete enough to miss the point entirely. The first one is the name, Al-Kazne, the treasury. Every photograph, every poster, every travel magazine cover, and every dentist's waiting room on Earth, it is always the treasury. The word treasury implies that someone, at some point, kept treasure there. The Bedouin legend says that an Egyptian pharaoh hid his gold inside the stone urn that sits on its upper level. This is why bullet marks pock the surface of that urn to this day. Generations of locals shooting at it, hoping to crack it open and release the fortune inside. There is no fortune. There is no gold. The urn is solid sandstone. And the building itself was almost certainly a tomb, possibly a temple, probably a royal mausoleum for a Nabataean king. We are not entirely sure, but we know with confidence what it was not. It was not a treasury. The name is a legend attached to something nobody living had an explanation for, which is something worth remembering when we talk about how thoroughly this civilization disappeared from human memory. The second myth is the word lost. Petra was not lost. It was lost to Western Europe. It was lost to the cartographers and the historians and the explorers who were producing the maps that decided what was real and what was not. But the Bredul Bedouin, the people who had been living in and around the ruins for centuries, knew exactly where it was. They made their homes in its carved chambers. They grazed their animals on the flat ground between the tombs. They carried oral traditions about who built it and why. The city was not lost. It was simply not on the maps that the people drawing maps cared about. Lost is a word that makes sense only from one direction. The third myth is the size. If you have seen photos of Petra, you have seen the treasury. Maybe also the monastery, which sits at the top of a 900-step climb and is actually larger than the treasury, 50 meters wide, 45 meters tall. But here is the full picture. Petra covers over 100 square kilometers. It contains more than 800 individual carved facades. It had a colonnaded street in Roman style, a great temple whose floor plan rivals any structure in the ancient Mediterranean, a theater carved directly from the hillside with seating for 8,500 people, a Byzantine church with mosaic floors of extraordinary quality, residential neighborhoods, market areas, caravanserais for visiting traders, and a network of roads connecting the city center to more than 100 satellite sites in the surrounding mountains. We have excavated somewhere around 15% of it. 15. The other 85% is still underground, still inside cliff faces, still waiting. Every few years, Petra surprises people who thought they already knew it. We will get to what they found in 2016. But first, the place needs context, because you cannot understand what the Nabataeans built without understanding the world they built it inside. Picture the ancient world in roughly 300 BC. Not the ancient world of marble columns and heroic paintings, the actual lived experience. Start with the smell. Not Petra, the ancient world in general. The major trade routes of the Middle East and Mediterranean in the 3rd century before the Common Era are defined by 3 commodities above almost anything else: frankincense, myrrh, spices. These are not luxuries in the modern sense, the way we might think of a nice candle or an expensive pepper grinder. In the ancient world, frankincense was burned at every significant religious ceremony across a geographic range stretching from Rome to India to China. Every temple, every royal court, every major sacrifice. The smoke of frankincense going up to heaven was not metaphor. It was theology, literally enacted every single day across hundreds of cultures simultaneously.
demand was constant, enormous, and essentially guaranteed by the basic structures of human religion.
The frankincense tree, Boswellia sacra, grows only in a narrow band of territory: southern Arabia, what is now Yemen and Oman, and the Horn of Africa. You cannot grow it anywhere else. The ancients tried. It does not travel. So every piece of frankincense that burned in Rome, in Athens, in Alexandria, in Babylon, in Persepolis, all of it had to be physically carried north and west from the southern tip of Arabia. Thousands of tons of it every year. One ancient trade estimate suggests that 3,000 tons of frankincense annually moved along the Arabian incense routes at the height of the trade. 3,000 tons, carried by camel across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. And all of it had to pass somewhere. Geography decides history more often than people give it credit for, and nowhere does it decide more clearly than in southern Jordan. Look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula. The incense routes north from Yemen have options. They can curve east toward the Persian Gulf, they can push west toward the Red Sea coast, or they can go straight north through the heart of the peninsula. The north route, the main artery, hits a pinch point. The terrain channels the caravans through a specific series of valleys and wadis in what is now southern Jordan, through the mountains of Edom, through the area the ancient world would eventually call Arabia Petraea, through Petra. Whoever controlled that geography controlled the tax on every piece of frankincense, every bottle of myrrh, every bag of cinnamon and cardamom and black pepper that moved from southern Arabia toward the consuming civilizations of the Mediterranean. In the ancient world, that was the equivalent of sitting at the toll booth between the oil fields and the refineries. It was the equivalent of owning the shipping lane. It was, in terms of strategic commercial geography, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. The Nabataeans understood this before anyone else did, and when they began building Petra in the valley of the Wadi Musa, the Valley of Moses, they were not building a city out of ambition or vanity. They were building a city because the road came through their mountain, and they were going to be ready for it. Now consider who surrounded them. To the north, the Seleucid Empire, the successor state of Alexander the Great, still enormous, still militarily formidable, hungry for commercial influence. To the west, Ptolemaic Egypt, one of the richest civilizations in the ancient world, desperate for the incense that its temples consumed by the ton. To the northwest, the Hasmonean kingdom, later to become Judea, ambitious and fractious. And lurking in the long shadow of the west, expanding, methodical, relentless, Rome, beginning its long climb toward controlling the entire Mediterranean world. The Nabataeans were a relatively small kingdom, surrounded by some of the most powerful states that had ever existed. And they survived. More than survived. They thrived for over 3 centuries in the middle of all of them. How does a small desert kingdom hold off Rome? How do you stay independent when your neighbors are empires? The answer starts with who the Nabataeans actually were. Here is the honest version. The Nabataeans appear in the historical record with a memorable debut. In 312 BC, a Greek general named Antigonus, one of Alexander's successors, a man who commanded armies of tens of thousands, sent a raiding force against the Nabataeans. 4,000 infantry, 600 cavalry, a serious military operation designed to demonstrate who was in charge and seize Nabataean wealth in a single swift strike. The Nabataeans killed most of them and sent the rest home. Antigonus sent another force. The Nabataeans were ready again. He gave up. This is the first time the Nabataeans show up in the written record, and what the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus records about them in that moment is fascinating. He notes they are an Arab people, perhaps 10,000 men strong at the time, distinguished from other Arab tribes by their wealth. They traded frankincense and myrrh and spices from southern Arabia, carrying goods that moved through their territory on the way to Mediterranean markets. They were, in Diodorus's description, fiercely independent. They refused fixed houses, refused wine, refused agriculture. They valued mobility and freedom above everything. Then, over the next 2 centuries, they built one of the most elaborate cities in the ancient world, carved it from solid rock in the middle of a desert,
and developed a taste for wine sophisticated enough that their output reached markets in Rome.
What happened in between is the story of an entire civilization undergoing the most remarkable transformation in ancient history. Because the Nabataeans did not just build a city, they reinvented themselves to suit the city they were building, and they did it on their own terms. Their language was a dialect of Aramaic, the common tongue of the ancient Near East, but their script, the particular way they wrote that Aramaic, evolved over centuries into something distinct, something fluid and increasingly cursive, until by the early centuries of the Common Era, Nabataean script was developing the connected letter forms that would eventually become the foundation of modern Arabic writing. Every letter you read in Arabic today carries in it a genetic memory of the Nabataean alphabet carved into the stone of Petra. That is not a metaphor. That is linguistic archaeology. The script descended directly and measurably from what the Nabataean merchants scratched onto contracts and tomb inscriptions and graffiti in the cliffs around their city. But what made them remarkable was not their language. It was the combination of commercial genius and cultural fluency that no neighboring power could quite replicate. Nabataean merchants did not simply carry goods, they understood goods. A Nabataean trader could assess the quality of frankincense by smell, could grade myrrh by texture, could navigate a trade negotiation in Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, and Arabic, depending on who sat across the table. They were the ancient world's most sophisticated commercial diplomats, and they kept their knowledge secret with a ferocity that was practically legendary. Greek and Roman writers repeatedly complained that Nabataean trade routes were treated as state secrets, wrapped in deliberately misleading stories to confuse competitors. When you asked a Nabataean merchant where the frankincense came from, you got a myth, a story involving dragons or giant flying snakes that guarded the trees. Disinformation, ancient style, deployed to protect market share. And here is the detail that genuinely surprises people. Nabataean women had legal standing that would have scandalized the Greeks and given the Romans pause. They could own property independently. They could enter contracts in their own names. They appear on inscriptions as merchants, as patrons of temples, as dedicants of funerary monuments, not as wives or daughters attached to male names, but as autonomous legal persons, conducting their own affairs. Nabataean queens appeared on coins alongside kings, not as decorative figures, as equals. In a world where Athenian women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and Roman women, though they had more latitude, were still structurally subordinated to male relatives, the Nabataean approach to women in commerce and public life was genuinely unusual. Their religion was equally distinctive. They worshipped primarily two deities, Dushara, a male god associated with stone and mountains, and Al-Uza, a female goddess associated with water, Venus, and fertility. And here is what makes their religious practice fascinating. They often represented their gods not as human figures carved in marble, the way Greeks and Romans did, but as abstract blocks of stone called beetles, a rectangular piece of smoothed sandstone mounted on a plinth, sometimes with eyes roughly indicated, sometimes with nothing at all, just the stone, just the presence. In a world drowning in anthropomorphic gods, with their human jealousies and human drama, the Nabataeans worshipped something almost minimalist, something that trusted the stone to carry the meaning, without the performance of a face. They held royal banquets that the ancient world talked about for their elegance. Greek observers attended and came away slightly confused. The Nabataean king reclined on cushions, not a throne. He ate relatively simply, despite sitting on one of the great fortunes of the ancient world. His queens and wives were present, reclining beside him, speaking in public, participating in conversation with guests, which to a Greek observer accustomed to women being excluded from the symposium was genuinely startling. One Greek account, noted by the historian Athenaeus, records that at these banquets the king drank from a golden cup, and that the poured libations were modest. The entire performance was calibrated. It said, "We are wealthy enough that we do not need to display wealth. We are powerful enough that we do not need to perform power." They grew wine in the Negev desert, which is, by every standard definition of agriculture, not a place where you grow wine. The Negev is classified as a hyper-arid zone. Annual rainfall is measured in single-digit millimeters in some areas. And yet, Nabataean farmers developed a system of runoff agriculture, precisely placed networks of small stone channels and terraced fields that captured every drop of rain that fell and directed it to root zones that allowed them to cultivate vineyards, olive groves, and grain fields in country that should not have supported any of it. The wine they produced traveled as far as Rome. Nabataean wine vessels, distinctive thin-walled pottery, instantly recognizable, have been found in archaeological digs across the Mediterranean. Desert wine. 2,000 years before anyone thought to describe that as a selling point. Think about what it means to build all of this and leave almost no written explanation of how. No agricultural manuals, no engineering treatises, no philosophical texts explaining their worldview. Thousands of inscriptions, yes, carved onto tombs and cliff faces and altar stones, but mostly names, dedications, contracts, the bureaucratic residue of a civilization, rather than its inner life. The Nabataeans kept their knowledge the same way they kept their trade routes, close to the chest, private. What we know about them, we know from what they built. And what they built is where the real astonishment begins. You need to understand one thing before we talk about how the Nabataeans built Petra. One fundamental thing that most people get backwards. They did not build it. They subtracted it. Petra is not constructed. Petra is carved. The distinction sounds simple. It is not. When a conventional architect builds a temple, they start with nothing and add. Foundation, column, lintel, roof, one piece on top of another, accumulating structure. When the Nabataeans made a monument, they started with a cliff face, the whole mass of the mountain already there, and they were moved. They took away. They peeled back the stone, layer by layer, from the top downward, revealing the building that was hidden inside the rock. The monument was always there. The Nabataeans just found it. And they started at the top.
This is the detail that breaks the brain when you fully grasp it. They did not build scaffolding from the ground up, the way European cathedral builders would do 1,000 years later. They began at the upper edge of the cliff face and carved their way down, lowering themselves on platforms suspended from above, descending as they worked deeper into the rock. Which means that when you look at the treasury and see the pediment at the very top, the triangular decorative feature perched 40 meters in the air, that was the first thing they made. That delicate upper cornice, the first thing your eye reaches for when you look up at the treasury, was carved before anything else below it existed. They began with the crown. The treasury itself, Al-Khazne, is approximately 40 meters tall and 28 meters wide. Those are the dimensions of a 12-story building, carved from a single cliff face. The facade is divided into two main registers, upper and lower, with 6 columns in the lower register framing a central doorway, and an elaborate arrangement of half columns, niches, and sculptural figures in the upper register, all of it topped by a broken pediment with that famous circular tholos in the center. Every element is executed with a precision that would have been demanding with modern tools. The Nabataeans did it with iron chisels and hammerstones and human hands lowered on ropes from above. But here is what the photographs never tell you. It was painted. The treasury, the bare, elegant rose-red stone facade that appears in every photograph that seems so austere and architectural in the desert light, was originally covered in painted decoration. Red, blue, yellow, white. The Nabataeans did not build in the minimalist aesthetic that modern viewers admire. They built in the maximalist color vocabulary of the ancient Mediterranean world. The paint has been bleached and worn away by 2,000 years of sun and wind and rain. What we see as sophisticated monochrome was experienced by the people who lived there as vivid, theatrical, almost overwhelming color. Every photograph of Petra is a faded version of the real thing.
The treasury is not even close to the largest monument. The monastery, a dare, is 50 meters wide and 45 meters tall. It sits at the top of a climb of 900 rock-cut steps, each one carved into the living mountain, winding up through a landscape of enormous boulders and carved niches and the occasional hermit's cell. You climb for 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how seriously you take it. And then you come around a corner, and it is simply there. Larger than you expected, even after you have read the dimensions. Larger than seems reasonable for a structure carved from a single cliff. The scale of it impossible to hold in a single field of vision. You have to move your whole head to take it in. Petra contains more than 800 individual carved facades of various sizes. Tombs, temples, triclinia, dining rooms carved into the rock for funerary banquets, where the family of the deceased would come to eat in the presence of their ancestor. Religious niches, cisterns, water channels. The stone of the surrounding mountains is not bare rock with buildings scattered through it. The stone is the building. The entire landscape has been worked. The theater deserves special attention. It was carved from a hillside that already contained older Nabataean tombs, and when the theater was expanded, they cut directly through existing burial chambers, repurposing them as vomitoria, the tunneled entrance corridors through which the audience entered. Imagine that for a moment. An earlier generation of Nabataeans carved tombs into a cliff. A later generation decided to build a theater in the same cliff and simply carved through the tombs to make the corridor they needed. There was something almost shockingly pragmatic about it. The dead had been honored. The stone was still useful. The city kept growing. The theater seated 8,500 people. In a city with a peak population estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000, that means more than 1 in 4 residents could attend at once. The Romans, who eventually took over Petra and modified the theater to suit Roman performance styles, recognized immediately that they were working with something excellent. They expanded it. Even the conquerors were impressed.
The Sikh was engineered as deliberately as any of the monuments. 1.2 kilometers of passage through the earth, in places just 3 meters wide, walls that block the sky. Parts of it are natural, formed by tectonic forces and shaped by millennia of water cutting through the stone. But the Nabataeans modified it comprehensively. The floor was smoothed and paved. Niches were carved at regular intervals for the offerings that traders would leave as they entered. Small religious observances, asking for divine favor on their commercial transactions. The water channels were cut into both sides. And at the northern mouth of the Sikh, the Nabataeans built a dam. A massive masonry dam across the Wadi Musa to divert the flash floods that during winter storms would otherwise roar through the narrow canyon and kill everyone inside it. The dam transformed the canyon from a death trap into a processional, and it positioned the treasury at the precise end of the journey. 1.2 kilometers of narrowing, rising, enclosed passage, and then the reveal. The approach was the architecture. The experience of arriving was designed from the moment you entered the canyon to the moment your eyes found the treasury, and everything in between was Nabataean stage management at urban scale. Now, we need to talk about the water, because everything else the Nabataeans built, the tombs, the temples, the theater, the treasury, all of it depends on solving one problem that should have made Petra impossible. There is no water here. Or rather, there should be no water here. The Wadi Musa receives on average about 150 millimeters of rainfall per year. That is desert classification. That is the level of precipitation that should support perhaps a few hundred people in scattered herding communities. Not a city of 30,000 with gardens and fountains and public pools and a constant supply of fresh water for the camel caravans that arrived by the hundreds, carrying animals that drank at a rate that would have drained a small reservoir. The nearest reliable spring, Ain Musa, the spring of Moses, connected by tradition to the moment in Exodus when Moses struck a rock and water flowed, is kilometers away from the city center. Too far to carry water by hand for a population of this size.
too far without infrastructure.
The Nabataeans built the infrastructure, and what they built is the thing that, when you fully understand it, reorders your entire picture of who these people were. Start inside the Sikh. On the right-hand side, as you walk toward the city, there is a channel in the cliff wall, or the remains of one, much of it reconstructed in modern times. This channel carried water from Ain Musa, routed along the cliff face, all the way through the canyon into Petra. That is the basic idea, a simple gravity-fed aqueduct. The Romans built many of these. It is impressive, but not extraordinary. Now look at the left side of the same canyon. There, instead of an open channel, the Nabataeans installed a ceramic pipe system. Interlocking terracotta pipes with tapered ends, fitted together in sequence, running along the wall. Sealed, pressurized, carrying water under pressure rather than by gravity flow alone. The Romans would develop this technique, pressurized ceramic pipe, and it would be celebrated as a Roman engineering achievement. But Ortloff and other hydraulic engineers who have studied Petra's water system have confirmed that the Nabataean installation predates the comparable Roman systems. They were doing this in the desert, centuries before Rome made it famous, and they maintained it with a precision that allowed the water to flow continuously without the pipes cracking from hydrostatic pressure. The pipes were designed with a specific declination slope of 2.8 degrees, not 2 degrees, not 3, 2.8, a calculation precise enough to maintain maximum flow without creating the pressure buildups that would split the clay joints. Modern engineers running computer fluid dynamic simulations on the system have found that the Nabataean pipe gradient is essentially optimal. They hit the right number in the 3rd century before the Common Era, without calculus, without computers, without a textbook that had not yet been written. That is just the pipe in the canyon. The full system includes dams at the canyon mouth to divert flash floods. It includes a network of channels carved into cliff walls and hillsides across the surrounding mountains, catching rain and runoff from catchment areas kilometers away and routing it toward the city. It includes over 200 kilometers of ceramic pipeline. That is the measured extent of the recovered pipeline fragments, running beneath the ground across the city.
It includes particle settling basins, which are stone tanks where incoming water was held still long enough for suspended sediment to drop to the bottom, leaving the water above clean enough to drink. It includes cisterns carved into the rock throughout the city, capable of storing millions of liters, reserves sufficient to carry the population through the dry months when the spring flow slowed and the rain did not come. And then there were the pools. In the city center, the Nabataeans built ornamental pools, fountains, gardens fed by the water system, evidence of lush planting in the middle of a desert, date palms, roses, vines, all of it kept alive by the flow that the engineers had coaxed from an uncooperative landscape. The Roman author Strabo, writing about Petra in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes a city with springs for domestic use and gardens. Springs in a desert, maintained not by miracle but by human intelligence, sustained over centuries by a population that had decided that living in this valley was worth whatever it cost to make the valley livable. The pools and the fountains were not practical decisions, they were statements. They announced to every visiting trader, every foreign ambassador, every skeptical general riding into Petra from one of the surrounding empires, that the people who built this city had mastered the desert so completely they could afford to waste water on beauty. In the ancient world, in the arid lands, water was power more directly than gold was power. To have enough water to make a fountain meant you had already won. You had already beaten the desert, and you were showing your work. And then there was the flash flood problem. Because for all its sophistication, the water system had one catastrophic vulnerability. The same wadi channels that carried rainwater down from the mountains toward the city could, in a bad winter storm, send a wall of water, meters high, moving at killing speed, straight through the Sikh and into the city center. Flash floods in this terrain are not gradually rising water. They are sudden, violent, and essentially unpredictable. They arrive in minutes. The Nabataean Dam at the mouth of the Sick was the solution. A massive masonry barrier that redirected floodwater through a tunnel blasted through the rock of the canyon wall, diverting it around the Sick rather than through it. The tunnel still exists. The dam's remains still exist. The engineering principle is elegant and effective. Instead of trying to slow or stop the flood, redirect it. Give it somewhere else to go. Let the water do what water does, just not in the direction that kills your city. In 1963, a flash flood tore through the Sick. 23 French tourists died. The Nabataean Dam had long since stopped being maintained. The water had nowhere else to go. It went straight through the canyon. It killed people in a place where 2,000 years earlier, the people who built that canyon had solved the exact same problem so thoroughly that it had not been a problem for centuries. The dam was not rebuilt after 1963. In 2010, another serious flood event in the area damaged infrastructure and endangered visitors. The problem the Nabataeans had solved was recreated by the absence of their solution. Their engineering was not remarkable because it was old. It was remarkable because when it stopped being maintained, people died. Now, you need to understand the city at its height, not the ruins, not the quiet rose-red stone of the empty afternoon. Petra at peak, somewhere between roughly 50 BC and 100 AD, when the frankincense trade was still flowing and the Nabataean kingdom was at the full extent of its wealth and influence. Walk through the Sick in the early morning light. The lamps in the wall niches are still burning, oil fed through the night, small flames that turn the narrow canyon walls amber and make the carved channels on either side catch the light. You can hear the water moving in the pipes on your left, the subtle, constant sound of the system working. Around you, ahead of you, behind you, there are people. Camel drivers from Yemen, 40 days into a journey that started near the frankincense groves of Dhofar. Merchants from Alexandria who speak Greek and carry letters of credit from Egyptian banking houses. A delegation from somewhere in the Haran region in the north, bringing grain to trade for the spices moving in the other direction. The camels smell overwhelming, a combination of animal and the distinctive resinous sweetness of the frankincense they carry in sealed amphoras strapped to their backs. And then the Sick curves, and the treasury appears. But you are not a tourist. You have been here before, or someone who taught you what to do has. You know the treasury is a tomb. You know not to stop and stare like you have never seen it, because that marks you as a newcomer. And in a trading city, newcomers get worse deals. You walk past it, past the larger open space where the facade faces you straight on, and you turn left and follow the crowd into the city. The colonnaded street is ahead of you, paved in limestone, lined on both sides with columns in the Corinthian style. The Nabataeans borrowed Greek architectural vocabulary because their clients spoke Greek and recognized wealth when it looked familiar. The columns frame the entrances to market stalls, workshops, temples. The smell changes as you walk, from the desert air of the Sick to something richer, layered. Frankincense smoke from a nearby temple, bread baking somewhere behind the market colonnade, dye from a workshop where cloth is being colored deep red and indigo, fish sauce imported from the Mediterranean coast, potent enough to announce its presence from 30 meters away. The city is loud. The Sick amplifies and then releases sound, the way it amplifies and releases people. And the open space of the city center hits you with the noise of commerce being conducted in half a dozen languages simultaneously. The Nabataean merchants, multilingual and culturally fluid, move between groups with the ease of people who have been doing this their entire lives. A scribe sits under a canopy near the main market, writing contracts in Nabataean Aramaic for those who want their deals recorded. The stone beneath his feet, and everyone's feet, has been worn smooth by decades of traffic. This is where 3,000 tons of frankincense per year pass through, where the ancient world's equivalent of a petroleum economy ran its central exchange, where silk from China, and glass from Egypt, and grain from the Haran, and spices from India changed hands in a market system that had been operating continuously for over 2 centuries before the Romans arrived.
The people who made this work,
who got up every morning in this city carved from desert stone and maintained the pipes and the channels and the cisterns and the market stalls and the trade relationships and the political alliances with every surrounding power simultaneously. They had full lives. They fell in love in this city. They argued about business over wine in these carved dining rooms. They watched their children learn the alphabet that would one day become Arabic. They buried their dead in tombs carved into the cliffs above the city, and they came back to eat meals in those tombs, reclining in rooms cut from the rock, feeling the presence of the people they had lost. They were not a mystery. They were not an abstraction. They were human beings who had looked at a hostile desert valley and decided to make it home, and who had made it more than home. They had made it the center of the ancient world's most important commercial network, sustained by water that should not have existed, and built from stone they had turned into art. And the ancient world's greatest empire was watching, and calculating, and waiting for its moment. Here is the thing about power in the ancient world. It was never really about armies. Armies cost money. Armies need to eat. Armies can be beaten by weather, disease, bad guides, and terrain that refuses to cooperate. The deepest, most durable form of power in the ancient world was the same as it is today. It was about who controlled what everybody else needed. And what everybody in the Mediterranean world needed, from Rome to Athens to Alexandria to Babylon, was the smoke rising from the altars. Frankincense, myrrh, the sacred resins that every civilization from Egypt to China burned in their temples, their royal courts, their private homes. The stuff that meant your prayer was real, your sacrifice was serious, your God was listening. You could not buy your way into divine favor without it, and it came from one place, the southern edge of Arabia, the trees of modern-day Yemen and Oman, a narrow ecological band where the Boswellia sacra tree grew, and nowhere else on Earth. 3,000 tons of it per year moved north and west along the incense routes toward the people who needed it. Every single kilogram of that 3,000 tons passed through Nabataean territory, and the Nabataeans taxed every kilogram. But here is the part most people miss. The Nabataeans did not just collect a toll, they ran the road. There is a difference between standing at a gate and demanding money from whoever passes, and being the only people in the world who know where every gate is, how each road connects, which stretch floods in winter, which wells have water in August, which tribal chiefs need to be paid to ensure safe passage, and which ones will take your money and still rob you 30 miles later. The Nabataeans knew all of this. They had been moving through this landscape for generations before they built a city in it. Their entire commercial advantage was not the city. The city was just the visible expression of something deeper, something that could not be conquered or copied, because it lived inside people rather than stone. It was knowledge. Specific, hard-won, carefully guarded, constantly updated knowledge about the land and the roads and the people and the trade. When a Roman merchant wanted to move goods from the Mediterranean coast to southern Arabia, or bring aromatics north from Yemen, he did not hire a general. He hired a Nabataean factor, a trading agent who knew the route, who had relationships with every tribal leader along the way, who could read the weather and the politics and the price of water at each stop. The Nabataeans charged for this, significantly, profitably, and they structured the charge so that it felt, to everyone involved, less like extortion and more like partnership. The road was safer when you traveled with Nabataean protection. The tolls were predictable. The contracts were honored. You knew what you were paying, and you knew what you were getting. This was not a shakedown. It was a service, priced at whatever the market would bear, and the market would bear quite a lot. The Romans knew exactly what was happening. They were not fooled. Rome's most sophisticated economists and geographers understood that the Nabataeans were sitting on the economic throat of the most valuable trade system in the ancient world. The question for Rome was always the same. What do you do about it? The first answer was military, and it was a disaster.
that Rome preferred not to talk about for years afterward.
Now, in 25 BC, Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, the man who had just finished dismantling the last of the Republic's pretensions and installing himself as the permanent, unchallengeable ruler of the Mediterranean world, sent an army into Arabia. 10,000 men under a general named Aelius Gallus, prefect of Egypt. The mission was to push through the Arabian Peninsula, find the source of the incense trade, and establish Roman control over the wealth that the Nabataeans had been collecting as middlemen. It was the ancient world's equivalent of deciding to invade the oil fields directly rather than keep paying at the pump. The Nabataeans helped him plan the route. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The people whose commercial monopoly Rome was trying to destroy were the guides for the expedition. A Nabataean official named Sylleus served as the expedition's primary guide and advisor. Sylleus led 10,000 Roman soldiers into the Arabian Peninsula for 6 months, through some of the most brutal desert terrain on Earth, through summer heat, through country where water sources were days apart and the men were already weakening, through territory where Sylleus seemed repeatedly to choose the longest route, the hottest path, the way that kept the army moving through landscape that could kill it slowly without a battle. Strabo, writing about the expedition afterward, suggested Sylleus led the Romans deliberately astray. The ancient sources are divided on how intentional the sabotage was, but the outcome is not debated. Of the 10,000 men who marched into Arabia, only 7 died in actual combat. The rest of the losses, and they were enormous, came from disease, heat, hunger, and exposure. 6 months of wandering in a desert that the Nabataeans could have navigated in 2. Gallus finally admitted defeat and turned the army around. They made it back to the Red Sea coast in 60 days, which tells you everything about how badly they had been led in circles during those 6 months. Rome made no further attempt to conquer Arabia by land. The Nabataeans had not fired a single arrow in their own defense. They had simply let geography and heat and a trustworthy-looking guide do the work. It was arguably the most efficient military victory in the ancient record. No troops deployed, no treasure spent. The empire retreated on its own, baffled and depleted, and the frankincense kept flowing north through Petra, and the tolls kept being collected, and nothing changed. This is who Rome was dealing with. Not aggressive, not confrontational, not interested in the kind of dramatic victories that got written into military histories. The Nabataeans played the long game in every sense of the phrase. They deflected, they misdirected, they made their territory too expensive, too difficult, too risky to occupy, not through walls and armies, but through knowledge that was impossible to purchase and terrain that was impossible to tame without their help. And it worked for 3 centuries. The second answer Rome tried was diplomacy, and it worked better. Rome and the Nabataean kingdom maintained a relationship that was somewhere between alliance and grudging mutual recognition. Rome needed the incense routes to function. The Nabataeans needed Rome's vast consuming market to remain prosperous. They taxed each other's goods at the borders, sent ambassadors, concluded treaties, maintained the fiction of mutual benefit, while each side watched the other for any sign of weakness. For 100 years, this equilibrium held. Then the world changed under the Nabataeans' feet in 2 ways they could not have fully anticipated and could not control. The sea routes opened and the desert dried. Maritime technology, specifically the Roman understanding of the monsoon winds that drove the Indian Ocean trade system, had been advancing for decades. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Roman and Greek merchant captains had figured out that the monsoon winds were predictable and seasonal, which meant you could sail from the Red Sea to India and back on a reliable schedule. The overland incense routes were suddenly competing with ships that could carry more, faster, with no tolls to Nabataean middlemen. The math began to shift. Not overnight, not catastrophically, but noticeably. And the Nabataean kingdom itself was aging. The line of kings that had built and maintained the city for 3 centuries was approaching its end. In 106 AD, the last Nabataean king, Rabel II, died. Within the same year, the Roman Emperor Trajan declared the former Nabataean territory to be the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. Nobody fully knows what happened in between. This is one of the most genuinely mysterious transitions in ancient history. The Nabataeans did not fight. There is no record of a military conquest, no triumphant battle account on the Roman side, no archaeological evidence of widespread destruction consistent with a Roman campaign. The annexation happened as if overnight, as if the kingdom simply agreed to become a province, or was too depleted at the end of the long royal line to resist, or was eased into absorption through a combination of political pressure and economic incentives that left no blood on the ground, but no freedom either. Some historians argue it was a peaceful handover, negotiated by elites who stood to gain from Roman patronage. Others see evidence of quiet coercion, Roman troops moving into position around the kingdom's edges in the years before Rabble died, making the outcome inevitable before it was announced. We do not know. The Nabataeans, characteristically, left no account of their own end, no lament, no last testament, no record of what it felt like to stop being a kingdom. What we know is what came after. The Romans built in Petra, a colonnaded street in their style, a monumental arch across the main processional way, a larger theater expanded from the Nabataean original. They made Petra a provincial capital, moved their administrative machinery in, and for a while the city continued to function. Trade still moved through it. The workshops still produced goods. The tombs were still being carved as late as the 2nd century of the Common Era, long after the formal annexation. Nabataean culture did not vanish when the Romans arrived. It merged. It absorbed and was absorbed. The local population learned Latin alongside their Aramaic. Roman decorative styles appeared on facades that were otherwise purely Nabataean in design. The city held more than one identity simultaneously, the way cities that survive long enough always do. But the trade was leaving.
Trajan completed a new road, the Via Nova Traiana, in 111 AD, linking the Red Sea port of Aqaba to Damascus through Bosra rather than through Petra. The road bypassed Petra. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just logistically. Bosra became the new provincial capital. Trade that had once flowed through the Sikh began to flow elsewhere. The merchants who had made Petra's markets pulse with the noise of a dozen languages started finding other stopping points. The caravanserais emptied slowly. The markets contracted. The population that had swelled to 30,000, maybe more, began a quiet exodus that would take centuries to complete. Then, the earth moved. On the 21st of May in 363 AD, a massive earthquake struck the southern Levant. Modern estimates put it at roughly 6.5 to 7 on the Richter scale, the kind of event that reshapes coastlines and topples cities. And Petra, built into mountainsides, carved from rock that had seemed immovable for centuries, was not immune. The earthquake destroyed significant portions of the built city. The colonnaded street collapsed. Numerous monuments were damaged. Most critically, the water infrastructure. The channels, the pipes, the cisterns, the dam suffered damage that could not be fully repaired without the kind of organized urban administration that was already fading. When a city's water system fails and cannot be fixed, the city empties. Not from violence, not from conquest, just from the basic calculation that humans make when the resources needed to sustain life become unreliable. You leave. You find somewhere else. You take what you can carry and you go. Petra drained. Over the following centuries, what had been 30,000 people became a few thousand, became hundreds, became a community of Bedouin who sheltered in the carved chambers of tombs and temples, and found in the ruins a kind of home that was nothing like what the Nabataeans had built, but was also, in its own way, a continuation. Life persisted in the stone, even as the civilization that had made the stone relevant was gone.
Byzantine Christianity replaced Nabataean religion. Some of the great tomb facades were converted into churches, crosses chiseled into walls that had once displayed abstract beetle stones, niches where oil lamps burned to deities whose names were no longer spoken. A Byzantine church built in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era,
its floor covered in extraordinary mosaic panels depicting hunting scenes and personifications of the seasons, stood near the city center. It would not be rediscovered until the 1980s. It had been sitting there, under the sand, for 1,500 years, the mosaics astonishingly intact beneath the accumulation of centuries. The Arab conquest of the 7th century passed through without leaving much mark on Petra. The city was already too small to matter strategically, too remote to justify major attention. The Crusaders, arriving in the 12th century, knew the valley existed. They called it Vallis Moisi, the Valley of Moses, connecting it to the biblical tradition that Moses had struck water from rock somewhere in this region, and built a small fortress called Waira in the surrounding hills to control the area. They held it for less than a century before Saladin's forces took it back in 1189. The Crusaders departed. Their fort crumbled. And Petra, which had once been the most important city in the ancient commercial world, settled into an obscurity so complete that within a few generations it had essentially vanished from Western consciousness. Not from the desert, not from the memory of the people who lived in it, but from the maps. For roughly 600 years, no European recorded visiting Petra. The Badul Bedouin continued to live among the ruins, to know the canyon and the tombs and the water channels the way they knew their own names. They had oral traditions about the city, stories that connected it to Moses, to Pharaoh, to the deep biblical history that saturated this landscape in the popular imagination of the region. They were not unaware of what surrounded them. They were simply not interested in explaining it to outsiders. And the outsiders, for 6 centuries, did not come.
Around 1800, a very small number of European scholars had begun to suspect that the ancient city of Petra, mentioned in Greek and Roman texts, known to have existed somewhere in the territory that the ancients called Arabia Petraea, might still be physically present somewhere in the mountains of southern Jordan. The texts described a city carved from rock, a city approached through a narrow gorge, a city at the center of the incense trade. But nobody in the European scholarly world knew exactly where it was, and the locals who knew were not offering tours. Enter Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, and everything about him is more interesting than the headline version. He was born in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1784, into a wealthy Basel family whose money came from silk manufacture. By the time he was 22, he was in London, trying to find employment, eventually falling into the orbit of the African Association, a British organization dedicated to mapping the interior of Africa and the Arab world, partly for scientific knowledge, partly for the imperial advantages that knowledge would provide. The association needed someone to travel to Timbuktu via an overland route through the Sahara. The journey would require passing through Cairo and across the Arab world. To do that safely, the traveler would need to pass as a local. To pass as a local, he would need to be undetectable as a European. Burckhardt went to Cambridge and studied Arabic, then to Aleppo in Syria, where he lived for nearly 3 years in the local community, buying a small house, taking lessons from a Syrian teacher, studying the Quran and Islamic law with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. He adopted the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. He dressed as a Bedouin traveler. He converted to Islam, or performed a conversion so convincing and so thorough that the debate about whether it was genuine has continued for 200 years, and his family denied it, and certain details of his later life suggest it was not entirely performance. He practiced speaking Arabic until his accent was no longer the giveaway it had been. He practiced writing Arabic in the cursive hand of the Nabataean descendants, the script that the Nabataeans had begun and the centuries had refined into the written Arabic of the 19th century.
By 1812, he was traveling south from Syria toward Cairo, moving through Jordan, carrying almost nothing. In Kerak, he trusted a local governor, who promptly relieved him of most of his remaining possessions and sent him south, with a guide who abandoned him in the desert shortly after. He found a Bedouin camp, secured another guide, and kept moving. Along the way, he heard something. People in the region spoke of ruins in a narrow mountain valley, ancient ruins, a place near the supposed tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, whose grave was said to sit atop a mountain about 4 kilometers from the valley. Locals referred to it with the kind of reverence mixed with wariness that people reserve for places they believe to be either sacred or dangerous, possibly both.
Burckhardt wanted to see it. He could not simply ask to be taken there. A foreign traveler asking to visit ancient ruins was, by definition, either a treasure hunter or an infidel seeking to practice some form of forbidden knowledge, both categories likely to get him killed in a region where his cover story was the only thing standing between him and serious violence. So he invented a pretext that he recorded quite straightforwardly in his journal. He told his guide he had taken a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron. It was the kind of pious obligation that no devout Muslim guide would refuse to accommodate. The tomb was in the valley. To reach the tomb, you had to go through the valley. The ruins were in the valley. On August 22nd, 1812, Burckhardt walked through the sick. His journal entry from that day runs to 12 handwritten pages, preserved today in the Cambridge University Library in 3 soft leather folders and a scrapbook volume. He describes the narrow gorge with what reads now as barely controlled excitement. He describes the walls rising on either side, the carved niches, the remains of the water channel. He describes walking through the curve where the treasury first appears, though he writes of it as a tomb rather than a treasury. He describes standing before the 40-meter facade, marveling at its scale and precision, measuring it mentally, recording details with the care of a man who knows he cannot stop and take visible notes without blowing the cover that is keeping him alive. He was terrified his guide would realize what he was doing.
At one point during the visit, as Burckhardt stared at the treasury with an intensity that was not quite consistent with simple piety, his guide apparently said something to the effect of, "I can see clearly now that you are an infidel." This is recorded in accounts of the visit. Burckhardt denied it. He maintained his composure. He completed the circuit of as much of the ruins as he could manage without arousing further suspicion. He sacrificed his goat at the tomb of Aaron, and that night he rejoined the road to Cairo as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He never returned to Petra. He died in Cairo 5 years later, at 32 years old, from dysentery, before he had finished editing the journals of his travels for publication. His notes were published posthumously, and when the European scholarly world read his description, the gorge, the treasury, the scale, the ancient inscriptions he had glimpsed, the response was immediate and urgent. Other Europeans came. Within 2 decades of Burckhardt's visit, Petra had been seen by multiple British and French travelers. Artists came and painted it. Architects came and sketched the facades. Archaeologists came and began to dig. The famous line, written by the Victorian poet John William Burgon in 1845, describing Petra as a rose-red city half as old as time, entered the English language and has never left it since. What none of those accounts adequately addressed, then or for a long time afterward, was the Bdul Bedouin, the people who had been there all along, who had never needed a 12-page journal entry to know where the ruins were because they were living in them. The people whose ancestors had perhaps watched the last Nabataean city dwellers leave and who had stayed and kept staying for generation after generation in carved stone chambers that had once been tombs and temples and were now simply home. The rediscovery of Petra is a real event and a meaningful event in the history of archaeology, but it is also a story that only makes sense if you define discovery as what happens when Western European scholarship writes something down. The Bdul did not need Burckhardt to discover Petra. Petra had never been lost to them. It had been hidden from outsiders by 6 centuries of their careful custodianship, their unwillingness to advertise their location, their correct understanding that outside attention to this place would mean outside control of this place. They were right about that too. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Here is what nobody talks about when they talk about Petra. In June of 2016, archaeologists Sarah Parcak and Christopher Tuttle published a paper in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research. Parcak, who works out of the University of Alabama at Birmingham, who has been called a space archaeologist, who has spent her career using satellite imagery to find things buried under ancient landscapes, had turned her tools on Petra. Not on some remote corner of it, on the city center, on the ground that hundreds of thousands of tourists walk across every year, near the colonnaded street, near the treasury, in the most studied and visited and photographed archaeological site in Jordan. She found a building nobody had documented before.
a massive ceremonial platform, 184 feet long and 186 foot wide. That is roughly the length of an Olympic swimming pool and twice the width, sitting less than half a mile from the center of the ancient city, approached by a monumental staircase, topped with a smaller structure, surrounded by a row of columns along its eastern side. The platform itself is enormous. The building on top of it is, by comparison, quite small, a relationship between large platform and modest focal structure that archaeologist Tuttle noted has no parallel anywhere else at Petra. It had no direct parallel. In a site that has been studied for 200 years, that has hosted archaeologists from dozens of countries across multiple generations of fieldwork, that has been walked over and photographed and surveyed and mapped until there are detailed records of most of its visible features, there was a major structure sitting there that nobody had properly documented. Tuttle told National Geographic, "I have worked in Petra for 20 years, and I knew that something was there, but it is certainly legitimate to call this a discovery." Think about what that means. A researcher who has spent 20 years of his professional life at one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites on Earth, standing near the city center, knowing something significant was there, and not having the tools available until satellite imagery and drone photography made it possible to see it properly?
The platform dates, based on pottery found on its surface, to the mid-2nd century BC, which would make it one of the earliest major structures at Petra, predating the treasury, predating the theater, predating most of what visitors see today. What it was used for remains genuinely unknown. Ceremony, almost certainly. Something public-facing, something large-scale, something that required the ability to see and be seen from a considerable distance. But the specifics are still emerging. We have excavated approximately 15% of Petra. The other 85% remains below ground, inside cliff faces, under the accumulated sediment of 2,000 years of desert. The 2016 discovery happened not in the unmapped wilderness at the edges of the site, but near its heart, which tells you something specific and slightly vertiginous about what we do not know. Elsewhere in the site, ongoing excavations continue to produce finds that reframe the picture. The Byzantine church discovered in the 1980s, its mosaic floors preserved in extraordinary condition beneath centuries of sand, had been standing in the city center, invisible, through the entire modern era of Petra archaeology. Every archaeologist who ever worked at Petra before the 1980s walked past it, stood on the ground above it, did not know it was there. Ground-penetrating radar is now being used to map subsurface structures without excavation. LiDAR scanning is producing three-dimensional models of the surrounding landscape, detailed enough to reveal ancient agricultural terraces and water management features that were invisible at ground level. Multispectral satellite imagery can detect soil disturbances that indicate buried features with a resolution that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. The map of Petra is being redrawn continuously. Every year, the picture gets more complex. Every year, the city turns out to have been larger, more sophisticated, more thoroughly organized than the previous year's understanding allowed for. And here is the question that sits behind all of this, quiet and persistent. If we are still finding major structures in the most studied part of the most visited ancient site in Jordan, structures sitting less than half a mile from the city center, hiding under the feet of 500,000 tourists per year, what is waiting in the parts of Petra we have barely looked at yet? In the mountains to the east and west of the main city, where Nabataean sites continue to be identified through satellite survey? In the underground spaces that radar is beginning to detect? The Nabataeans kept their trade route knowledge as a state secret. They kept their hydraulic engineering principles unwritten. They built a city over 3 centuries whose full extent we still cannot map. And they left in the ground their final archive, the one that cannot be confiscated or burned or forgotten. A record so comprehensive that 2,000 years of sand and earthquake and empire have not finished revealing it. The city is still talking. We are still learning how to listen. Now, come back to the present. Come back to the sick, to the rose-red stone,
to the 300 days of sunshine per year that beat down on the most visited site in Jordan. Nearly 1 million tourists arrived at Petra in the year before the global pandemic. They came from every country on Earth, moving through the Sick in flows that at peak hours made the 1.2-kilometer canyon feel like a very narrow, very old airport terminal. They emerged from the narrowing passage at the treasury end, stopped, gasped, took photographs. Every single one of them reproduced in their first moment of seeing the facade the reaction the Nabataeans had engineered for visiting traders 2,000 years ago. The choreography still works. The architecture of revelation is perfectly intact. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was filmed here in 1989. The scene where Harrison Ford emerges from a narrow canyon and sees the Temple of the Breath of God for the first time, the camera pulling back, the facade filling the screen, was filmed at the end of the Sick, with the treasury as the exterior of the fictional temple. The moment in the film where the character is suddenly confronted with something vast and ancient and unexpected mirrors exactly the experience the Nabataeans designed.
A film production team hired location scouts and cinematographers and set the scene up as carefully as they could, and what they produced was essentially the Nabataean visitor experience, reproduced for a late 20th century audience with a budget and a famous actor. It took 2,000 years, and Steven Spielberg, to confirm that the original architecture was brilliant. But beneath the tourism economy, beneath the Instagram angles and the camel rides and the souvenir vendors selling small treasury replicas in 3 different sizes, there is a tension that does not resolve neatly and does not photograph well. The Badul Bedouin, who had lived in Petra's carved chambers for generations, were relocated in the 1980s. When Jordan formally designated Petra as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and moved toward the infrastructure required for large-scale tourism, the people who had been the site's custodians for centuries were moved to a purpose-built village called Sayhun on the plateau above the valley. They did not leave voluntarily, in any meaningful sense of that word. They were moved because their presence in the ruins was classified as incompatible with archaeological preservation, which is a real concern and also simultaneously a historical irony of some magnitude. The people whose ancestors preserved Petra through 6 centuries of Western indifference by living in it and knowing it and keeping strangers out were removed from it in the name of protecting it. They continue to work in the site as guides and horse handlers and vendors and camel drivers. Some of the best Petra guides in Jordan are Badul, people who grew up knowing every path through the surrounding mountains, every tomb name, every water channel, with the intimacy that comes from ancestral habitation rather than academic study. The official information at the site does not always tell you this. The plaques and the visitor center focus on the Nabataeans and the Romans and the Crusaders and Burckhardt. The Badul, who are the most recent chapter of a very long story of continuous human presence in this valley, are often rendered invisible in the official narrative, which is a particular kind of forgetting, different from the forgetting that erased Petra from Western maps, but forgetting nonetheless.
The site generates roughly 40% of Jordan's tourism revenue in a normal year. The road from Petra's visitor center to the Sick entrance is lined with souvenir stalls and horse stands, and the particular ambient commercial energy of a place that knows it is a wonder of the world. Vendors offer miniature treasury replicas in rose-colored stone, silver Nabataean jewelry, bottles of layered colored sand, camel rides, horse-drawn carriages through the Sick. The Nabataeans, the greatest commercial operators of the ancient world, would probably have found this entirely comprehensible, and possibly would have had notes about margin optimization. But the city itself, the stone, the scale, the silence you find when you go beyond the main tourist trail into the surrounding mountains, that is unchanged. That is exactly what it has always been. The monastery, reached after 900 steps of climbing through a landscape of enormous boulders and carved niches and the occasional Bedouin tea stall, sits in the same stillness it has always occupied. The royal tombs glow in the afternoon light the way they glowed when Nabataean families came to dine with their dead in rooms carved from the cliff. The Sick narrows and the walls rise, and the sound of the modern world diminishes and then disappears,
and then all that is left is what was always there. Stone, wind, the faint groove of the water channel. And at the end of the curve, between two walls of sandstone, the corner of a column. And now, as the stone begins to blur at the edges of your attention, let us hold the whole shape of this story for just a moment before we let it go. The Nabataeans started as traders in the desert, moving goods that the ancient world could not live without. They looked at a canyon in the most inhospitable corner of southern Jordan and saw not an obstacle, but an architecture. They moved water through pipes at gradients so precise that modern engineers need computers to verify what the Nabataeans worked out with string and observation and the accumulated knowledge of people who had been watching this landscape for generations. They carved a city from the inside of a mountain. They built a theater for 8,500 people and a market that served customers from 3 continents.
They kept Rome, the greatest military force in human history, at diplomatic arm's length for 3 centuries. And when Rome finally absorbed them, they adapted. They became Roman, became Byzantine, became Arab, became Bedouin. And the knowledge that mattered, the deep knowledge of the land and the rock and the water, passed from generation to generation through all of it. Think about what it means to build something so permanent and so personal that 2,000 years of neglect cannot erase it. The Nabataean water channels still cut through the sick walls with the precision they were made with. The Nabataean pipe gradient still hits 2.8 degrees of declination. The reveal of the treasury at the end of the sick still produces the gasp it was designed to produce. These things are not coincidences. They are the residue of intelligence, applied so thoroughly to specific problems that the solutions outlasted everything that surrounded them. And the script of the language they wrote in? Nabataean Aramaic, the flowing cursive hand they developed over centuries of commerce and record-keeping, chiseled into cliff faces and scratched onto contracts and painted onto tomb walls across a kingdom that stretched from the Sinai to the Hijaz, evolved, letter by letter, century by century, into the Arabic script that over 1 billion people write in today. If you are reading this in Arabic right now, you are reading in an alphabet that carries Petra in its bones. If you are writing in Arabic, you are tracing, very faintly, the memory of a Nabataean merchant recording the price of frankincense in a canyon in the Jordanian desert 2,000 years ago. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is linguistics. It is measurable. The connection is real. The Nabataeans did not vanish. They adapted, as they always had, and they are still here. In the alphabet, in the water management techniques that modern engineers study in graduate programs, in the faces of the Badul guides who walk the paths of Petra with the ease of people who grew up knowing every stone, in the mosaic floors of a Byzantine church that sat silently under the sand for 15 centuries waiting to be found, in the platform discovered in 2016 that nobody had properly documented in 200 years of archaeology. The city is not lost. It was never lost. It has been here the whole time, doing what good architecture always does, waiting patiently for whoever is ready to look carefully enough. And as the rose-red cliffs settle into their evening colors, amber in the late light, then deep purple, then the particular darkness of a desert night where the stars are closer than you expect, and the stone holds the warmth of the day long after the air has cooled, let the details begin to drift. Let the water channels blur. Let the precise slope of 2.8 degrees soften into something more general, something about the intelligence of people who loved a problem enough to solve it perfectly. Let the treasury facade fade from 40 meters of precise carved stone into just the feeling of something enormous and intentional, something made by human hands to outlast human lifetimes. You do not need to hold all of it tonight. The city has been holding it for 2,000 years and will keep holding it long after tonight. The sick will still be there. The water channels will still be there. The treasury will still be standing in the morning light, still doing what it was built to do,
still stopping the breath of whoever comes around the final curve of the canyon and sees it for the first time. The Nabataeans understood something that most civilizations miss. They understood that the most durable things are not the things that resist the world, but the things that work with it. Water does not fight the rock, it finds the path. You do not conquer a desert, you learn it, precisely and completely, and you let that learning become the thing you build on. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever complexity, whatever unresolved question, whatever weight that sits between you and sleep, you can put it down for now. It will still be there to pick up tomorrow, the way the stone is still there, the way the water still knows its channel.
The cliffs are rose red somewhere in southern Jordan right now, in the dark, the way they have been for longer than anyone currently alive can fully comprehend. The crack in the earth is quiet. The water that remains in the old channels has long since soaked into the sand. The stars above the sick are the same stars the Nabataean merchants navigated by, crossing the desert in the dark with the weight of the ancient world's most precious goods on the backs of their camels. They knew where they were going. You can rest now. You can let the canyon narrow behind you and the walls close in until the sky is just that ribbon of light, and then even that goes dark. And there is just the stone, the old warm stone that has been here for all of it, that has held the heat of 1,000 sunsets, that is still holding it now, quietly, in the dark. The city is not lost. You found it. Now you can go to sleep.